Good evening, everyone. My name is Guy Lancaster, and I serve as the editor of the Online Encyclopedia of Arkansas, which is a project of the Central Arkansas Library System. I would like to welcome you to tonight's lecture by Dr. Cherisse Jones-Branch titled, "To Make the Farm Bureau Stronger and Better for All People, African Americans and the American Farm Bureau Federation, 1920 to 1966. This lecture is one of many events relating to Black History Month, sponsored by the Central Arkansas Library System. Another event that might be of interest to you is the weekly A Conversation Worth Having, hosted by the Cowles Ron Robinson Theater every Wednesday evening this month at 7 p.m. To see a full listing of such events, go to cals.org. And if you want to visit the research room of the Bobby L. Roberts Library of Arkansas History and Art, for your own historical or genealogical inquiries, we are open to the public Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 10 to 5. Tonight's lecturer is Dr. Cherisse Jones-Branch, who serves as the Dean of the Graduate School and the James and Wanda Lee Vaughn Endowed Professor of History at Arkansas State University. She has written numerous articles on women's civil rights and rural activism, wrote the 2014 monograph, Crossing the Line, Women and Interracial Activism in South Carolina During and After World War II, and co-edited the 2018 collection, Arkansas Women, Their Lives and Times. Her second monograph, Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps, Black Women's Activism in Rural Arkansas 1914 to 1965, will be published in June of 2021 by the University of Arkansas Press. And I'm adding the link for that in the chat. You can pre-order the book, and if you click on the link, you'll notice that it's on sale for about $16 off the cover price. I already have mine on order, and you should too. If you don't buy it now, you're essentially wasting money. Following this presentation, we will have a brief Q&A. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to put them into the chat. And again, be sure to pre-order Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps. And with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Jones-Branch.
Good evening. I'm very glad to be with everyone today, and thank you for having me this evening. I'm especially appreciative of the Central Arkansas Library System and Guy Lancaster for the invitation, and thank you also, Heather, for taking care of the virtual logistics. So I'll go ahead and get started. In 1921, after listening to the Dalton Farm School, also known as the Bartlett Agricultural and Industrial School Negro Quartet, perform at the Missouri State House in Jefferson City, Speaker of the House Samuel O'Fallon introduced Nathaniel Coleman, or NC Bruce, the Missouri Negro Farm Bureau chairperson. Bruce talked about the work being conducted at the school, which he headed, and the fact that it had the world record for the largest corn yield that year. He then urged politicians to establish a much needed agricultural experimentation station at the school. The Missouri Negro Farm Bureau, first established in 1917 as the Central Negro Farm Bureau, boasted nearly 4,000 members in 1921. N.C. Bruce, known as the Booker T. Washington of Missouri, and African-American farmers were among the first, or among those who founded the organization in response to the needs of thousands of African Americans who had migrated to southeastern Missouri in response to the cotton acreage increase that desperately required their labor. Up until this point, most rural African Americans resided in central and eastern Missouri, but some of them were also independent rural landowners who owned property worth approximately $16.5 million, according to the Missouri Negro Industrial Commission. This undermined the long-held stereotype that all agrarian Blacks labored on white-owned land. Nor were Black farmers only interested in agriculture. When Bruce spoke at the Missouri State House in 1921, he lobbied for both equal education and economic opportunity and access, issues that increasingly concerned both rural and urban African Americans following the end of an international war. Throughout rural America, county farm bureaus were established to support local agricultural communities, and extension service agents. State and local leaders had contemplated galvanizing country farm bureaus to create a national organization. Some states, like Missouri, had federated county farm bureaus as early as 1915. By the end of World War I, 10 states had followed suit. In 1919, farmers from around the country gathered at LaSalle Hotel in Chicago and formed the American Farm Bureau Federation, or AFBF, to solidify the alliance between county agents and farm people and to ensure a collaboration that lobbied on behalf of both groups. The name Farm Bureau was adopted by the United States Department of Agriculture, or the USDA, to include all cooperating farm organizations. The permanent AFBF was established in 1920. Most AFBF scholarship has almost exclusively discussed white agriculturalist history and concerns and have not probed the origins nor the efficacy of African American farm organizations, many of which were formed later in the 20th century. Like their white counterparts, Black farmers worried about diversifying their crops following World War I. In April 1921, in Troup County, Georgia, for instance, the Colored Farm Bureau Advisory Board met to discuss the importance of reducing cotton acreage, increasing production of feed, foodstuff, and safe farming practices as farmers throughout the South continued to fight the boll weevil infestation. But Black Farm Bureau members were also cognizant of the difficult circumstances in which many African Americans found themselves in the late 1920s and relied on resources of multiple organizations to address their issues in communities. In 1927, when the Missouri Negro Farm Bureau hosted its 9th annual meeting, attendees were regaled by addresses from college administrators, bankers, agricultural specialists, extension service agents, the State Board of Health, the Negro School State Inspector, and the Knights of Pythias, all of whom emphasized the need for racial cooperation, race pride, and thrift among Black farmers. Discussions on the program included such diverse topics as the church and the farmer, the profit and losses of the poultry business, saving our boys and girls, making hogs pay, and health and sanitation. And please note that this particular article came from the Negro World, which was the newspaper founded in 1918 by Jamaican activist Marcus Garvey. Although African Americans were largely marginalized in state farm bureaus, efforts to augment Black farm life did not abate, and they continued to seek inclusion within the Farm Bureau through their connections to such organizations as the National Federation of Colored Farmers, or the NFCF. Established in Chicago in 1922 by James Perry Davis, who in the 1950s, by the way, was Little Rock's USDA administrative officer, the NFCS was initially limited to farmers on the Midwestern prairies until 1929, when Southern Black farmers joined the organization, largely attracted by its newspaper, The Modern Farmer. And so what I have here are just a couple of slides where Black farmers are being urged to organize. And of course, the slogan of the organization was, "Stay on the farm if you're on it, go back to the farm if you're off it." And so you can see their platform for the organization. On this slide, I apologize. I know this is difficult to read, but the National Federation of Colored Farmers Incorporated. And here is an application for membership along with the front page of the Modern Farmer, which ran from about 1929 until the mid to late 1940s, I believe. Segregated Farm Bureau affiliates, however, were being founded or existed in the 1930s. And so this is just another example here from Kentucky, where they formed their Farm Bureau in 1936, and also one in Selma, Alabama. And if you search the newspapers, there are tons of examples of colored Farm Bureau organizations being formed in Alabama and Mississippi. And that makes sense because those are two of the southern states that had the largest Black populations. In 1937, St. Francis County Negro Farm Bureau sponsored a barbecue in Crow Creek, 3 miles east of Forest City, where tenant farmers heard from the president of Arkansas A&M College and a regional field agent from the Washington, D.C. based Soil Conservation Service, who talked about the Farm Bureau's educational value, the opportunities it offered, and the importance of cooperation between landlords and tenants. In the norm, however, many impoverished African Americans, tenants, and sharecroppers were forced to become members by unscrupulous landlords seeking to bolster their own position within the organization. And this is just an image here of Jenny Booth Moten. She was the wife of Robert Russa Moten, who was the second president of Tuskegee Institute. And she spent a lot of time in Arkansas in the 1930s and the early 1940s because she was one of the few African Americans who worked for the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. And she also attended this meeting. This is just another example of an earlier Negro Farm Bureau that was established in Avery, Arkansas, just outside of Star City. And I believe that's in Lincoln County. So as I was saying, in the norm, however, many impoverished African American tenants and sharecroppers were forced to become members by unscrupulous landlords seeking to bolster their own position within the organization. So in 1942, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, established in Tyronza, Arkansas in 1934, wrote the NAACP claiming that while low-income farm families in Alabama, Arkansas, and Mississippi made up 75% of the Farm Bureau's membership, most of its leadership consisted of large landowners who were largely concerned about commodity prices and significantly less so about improving conditions among their impoverished laborers. And you can see here, this is a letter from the Southern Tenant Farmers Union that went to Walter White in 1942, where he's talking about that. The Southern Tenant Farmers Union, or the STFU, further asserted that the Alabama Farm Bureau, for instance, launched a massive campaign to build a mass following among all classes of farmers in cooperation with Tuskegee Institute. By 1936, the Alabama Farm Bureau had over 20,000 members. In 1942, as I said here, founder H.L. Mitchell writes to the NAACP and Walter White detailing the AFBF's operations in the rural South. And he provided a very lengthy, detailed confidential report titled The Farm Bureau in the South, along with affidavits. So he chronicled the AFBF's efforts to curb the New Deal's response to sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and small farmers by attempting to dismember the Farm Security Administration, from which many of the rural poor benefited because it helped to improve the degraded conditions in which they lived and labored by allowing them to purchase their own family farms or encouraging them to plant gardens rather than massive amounts of cotton. The report was highly critical of the large Farm Bureau membership in the Mississippi Delta. In Arkansas, Farm Bureau membership was higher in eastern counties than in any other part of the state. In 1942, for instance, the Farm Bureau reported 2,590 paid members in St. Francis County, although, according to the 1940 census, there were only 705 farmers in the entire county and 2,030 tenant and sharecropping families, most of whom were Black. When interviewed, many of these folks reported not ever having attended a meeting, taking part in an election for Farm Bureau officers, or determining any policies or programs within the Farm Bureau, although they again constituted the majority of the membership. And to be completely fair, this also applied to poor white farmers, tenants, and sharecroppers. In order to augment Farm Bureau numbers, plantation owners utilize an involuntary checkoff method to collect membership dues. In Mississippi in 1941, the Farm Bureau reported a membership of 19,000 in the Delta counties of Bolivar, Coahoma, Quitman, Sunflower, Tunica, and Washington, where 73 to 91% of the farm population was African American. That number was approximately half of the 28,901 members in the state. Owners collected dues by deducting $2 from day laborers' wages or charging the same amount to sharecroppers' commissary accounts. The Mississippi Farm Bureau also collected dues from the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or AAA checks. Owners were often present when tenants and sharecroppers received their money and claimed that a balance was due from the check, which they were denied if they did not pay. Additionally, signs were hung in county AAA offices that erroneously read, quote, "Pay your Farm Bureau dues here. The Farm Bureau is responsible for getting your AAA payments." Black agricultural laborers, however, were nearly passive in their oppression and resented being forced to pay AFBF dues when they had never truly participated in the organization. And these recorded accounts from Mitchell reveal how African Americans were forced to become members of an organization that did not truly represent their interests as agriculturalists. And what I have here on the next couple of slides are just a couple of examples from the affidavit. So the first one here is from William Ayers, a gentleman in Heflin, Alabama. And it says here, he's at the AAA office. They deduct $2 from his check for the Farm Bureau. And he said he didn't want to join the Farm Bureau, but was told that he needed to be in the Farm Bureau, and they kept his $2. In a second example, in Round Pond, Arkansas, which I believe is also in St. Francis County, he was essentially charged, he was charged more, he was charged $2.50, and he said he never received any sort of notification that he was a member of the organization, although he regularly received the newspaper published by the Bureau. And again, that there were 60 families on this plantation, and all of them are members of the Farm Bureau without their knowledge or their consent. In these examples here, again, they're being charged $2.50 for their membership in the organization. Their first knowledge came when they started receiving the Farm Bureau magazine. In Cotton Plant in Woodruff County, Arkansas, H.B. Lee is told that if he wants to farm in the same place, that is essentially if he doesn't want to leave his job, lose his job, or be kicked off the plantation, he had to be a member of the Farm Bureau. And in the last example in Sunflower County, Mississippi, it's the same thing again, charged $2. And Mr. Johnson says he never attends meeting. He doesn't know anything about them, doesn't know when or where they're held. And there are tons and tons of examples of this in the records. As I was saying, there are many problems with African Americans' participation in the American Farm Bureau Federation, especially at the local level. State federations have their own rules about who can become members. So for example, even though they couldn't fully participate in the Alabama Farm Bureau, Alabama did permit Blacks. They didn't necessarily have to have a segregated Farm Bureau, but Louisiana did not. They have to have a segregated Farm Bureau. And again, many of these people are admitted to the main body of the organization, but not entitled to all of the rights and privileges of membership. So this is just another example here where someone brings attention to the governor saying that in Alabama, they're taking money from these people, but they are not full members in the organization. So even if they were excluded in some ways from the Farm Bureau, Black agrarians always advanced their own interests, which included responding to civil rights issues by founding Farm Bureau chapters in the late 1940s and the 1950s. So in Arkansas, where the Negro division of the Farm Bureau Federation had been founded in 1948, President and Crittenden County farmer John Gammon Jr. lambasted, for example, the conditions in African American schools in 1950 before the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court decision, when he asserted that, quote, the conditions in the Crittenden County schools constituted a, quote, denial of educational opportunities and facilities for his children, and that, quote, Black children just don't get what they need. And so this is when the Negro division of the Arkansas Farm Bureau Federation was established in 1948. It was first the Arkansas Negro Farmers Association, and shortly after that, they changed the names. This is an image from the 1940s of the Arkansas Farm Bureau Federation Negro Division. And this is what I was talking about when I mentioned them challenging unequal and segregated schools before Brown versus the Board of Education. And it says very clearly here that the Arkansas Farm Bureau Prexy blasts unequal facilities of county schools. So he was talking specifically about Crittenden County, but then he also talked very generally about the poor conditions in schools, Black schools around the state. Now, on very rare occasions, prominent African Americans were actually invited guests of the Farm Bureau. And I just want to point this out very quickly before I move on. They challenged segregated schools, but then they also, as you can see here, approved a proposal in 1952 to help send medical students to send students to medical school with the understanding that they would return to Arkansas and practice in rural areas. And I think it's important to note this because even now we have a medical school at Arkansas State University, and many of the folks attending that institution are doing so with the understanding that they will practice in rural areas in this state. So that is just to say that this idea isn't new. The Negro Division of the Arkansas Farm Bureau Federation had been talking about this back in 1952. And this is just a brochure from the Arkansas, the Negro Division's 11th annual convention in 1958. Couple of more examples, just because I want to emphasize that Negro segregated farm bureaus are still being established in the 1950s. So here's an example from St. Joseph, Louisiana. Another example from Orangeburg, South Carolina, because I know some of my South Carolina folks are on the line. And a final example from Sikeston, Missouri. And that's one of the issues with the Farm Bureau. We're not just talking about the Farm Bureau excluding African Americans in the southern states. African Americans are farming in other parts of the country as well. So I have examples from other parts of Missouri. I have examples from southern Illinois. I have examples from Oklahoma. So this goes beyond what's going on in the South. Now, as I was saying, on very rare occasions, prominent African Americans were actually invited guests of the Farm Bureau. So in 1954, Edith S. Sampson, a former United Nations delegate and Chicago attorney, became the first African American and woman to address the 36th annual California Farm Bureau Federation meeting held in Long Beach, where she informed the audience that the Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court decision would contribute to American prosperity in the years to follow. And you see here where she talks about that in the Jackson Advocate, which was an African-American newspaper from Jackson, Mississippi. And here's another example from the New York Age, which I believe was an African-American newspaper in New York City. And she emphasizes in talking to this group of farmers, essentially, that this was a good thing. The Supreme Court decision is a good thing because racial bias, racial discrimination hurts the United States, not just nationally, but also internationally, because again, she was a delegate to the United Nations. The fight for civil rights and full inclusion in the Farm Bureau continued into the 1960s, when Black farmers representing 13 southeastern states at the 18th Annual Professional Agricultural Workers Association, or the PAWA, conference met at Tuskegee Institute, they agitated to gain a more prominent voice in the AFBF at the policy-making level. Founded in 1894 by Booker T. Washington, the PAWA declared that they were dissatisfied with the, quote, annual Farm Bureau fish fry by the river, end quote, at which African Americans were typically segregated. Black members wanted increased visibility, activity, and representation within the organization. The conference chairman declared that, quote, Negro Farm Bureau members are being distinctly discriminated against on all the local levels, end quote. He further claimed, we are, quote, acting to make the Farm Bureau stronger and better for all the people. However, local farm bureaus remained segregated into the mid-1960s. And this is just another example of African-American farmers saying that we want more of a say, we want more visibility within the American Farm Bureau Federation. These are just a couple of examples of the fact that the Farm Bureau remained segregated well into the mid-1960s, 1962 at least in Greenville, South Carolina, and this is in Hope, Arkansas in 1964. However, many by 1966, like the Arkansas Negro Division, had been integrated into the larger organization. Now, because this is part of a larger study I'm working on, I have many questions I want to answer. For instance, what did integration mean for Black farmers' participation in the Farm Bureau? What did they gain, but what did they lose? How did Black members influence agricultural policy? Were they able to access leadership opportunities within the main body of local farm bureaus? What mechanisms did Black farmers utilize through the Farm Bureau to assert their critical roles in agricultural production? Did integration provide the freedom African Americans had enjoyed within their segregated affiliates? Were they able to freely speak to and address the issues that concern rural Black farming communities in the late 1960s, like the increasing loss of land? How or did they leverage their membership to address rural civil rights issues? And how did African American women employ their extensive networks and their gender to increase Farm Bureau membership and to create autonomous spaces for themselves within the organization? Finally, how is the 21st century version of the AFBF addressing civil rights issues? And I just want to provide one example here from July 3rd, 2020, in which the Farm Bureau says it wants to fight racism and even issued a statement about the death of George Floyd. This is important. This is important because, number one, violence was often a fact of life for Black people in the rural South or in rural areas generally. And number two, as it says in the article, Black farmers have long experienced racism and discrimination in ways that have not fully been explored in Farm Bureau literature. This is still an incredibly important issue for Black agriculturalists in the 21st century. So this project, which is just the beginning of my newest book project, will then challenge, shift, and productively complicate, I hope, analyses about agrarian Black people, and will indeed center their experiences within the Farm Bureau organization or within Farm Bureau organizations across the country, better foreground their agency in agricultural spaces, and become a critical addition to agricultural, civil rights, and African American historiography. Thank you.
All right. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I wanted to throw out this question. Do we have any figures on percentages of membership in the Farm Bureau for various states, Arkansas and surrounding states?
Recent figures?
Recent or historical?
In the larger organization, the numbers, depending on the time period that you're talking about, the numbers are not very large, and they're not very large now. And of course, that goes right along with the fact that many African Americans who owned land or who were part of farming families rather, no longer own that land, or they're no longer in the farming business at all. But the numbers have never been very large. The largest participation in the Farm Bureau, from what I have found, and again, this is a fairly new project, was when they were members of Negro divisions.
Mm-hmm. Do you think maybe that at some point having a separate division provided a level of camaraderie, that they wouldn't get just being, I guess, part of the larger organization?
Oh, absolutely. It absolutely did. There is something to be said for segregated organizations because of that, right? They had a level of autonomy. They were able to develop leadership skills. They were able to utilize certain kinds of networks that probably weren't as readily available to them once these organizations were absorbed into the larger organization.
Hmm.
Mhm.
And I was thinking too a bit like uh, the issue of Black schools. You do have that level of leadership that doesn't get moved over, once schools are
Right,
integrated. That
right.
the people who develop leadership skills and roles, in these separate Negro divisions, probably weren't allowed to carry over their skills into the larger
Not
organization.
not so much. I mean, if we talk specifically about the Negro Division of the Arkansas Farm Bureau Federation, um, the most prominent member was John Gammon. And if you look at the scholarship, when there's no scholarship on this, but if you look at the resources on this, his name is the one that comes up the most often,
Mhm.
right? And even if you were to look at the one very slim book on the Arkansas Farm Bureau Federation, his name, there may be another name, but his name is the one that comes up most frequently.
Okay.
Mhm.
We do have some questions in the chat. What led you to delve into this area of history?
I'm very interested in rural history. And when I was working on my first book, I talked a little bit about women's roles, Black women's roles in the Arkansas Farm Bureau Federation. And then I said, I need to do a larger project about this. Because the story in Arkansas is fairly robust. And I just assumed that that would be the case in other parts of the country, particularly in other parts of the South, in states like Mississippi and Alabama that have large Black populations. But rural history is very interesting to me because I'm very interested in why Black people chose to stay. And that's not the story we typically hear. We hear about Black people migrating out of the South. We never talk about the Black people who returned or the Black people who made the conscious decision to stay. Also, I'm about disrupting narratives because I really need people to understand that being rural and Black in the South did not, by definition, mean that you were always poor or always without power. That's just not true. We just really haven't explored that in the way that we need to. Both things are true. Some Black farmers, like John Gammon, for example, did extremely well and owned quite a bit of land. And his story, at least at that time, was not unusual. But we don't talk about that. And I think it's important that we highlight the fact that Black people were members of the American Farm Bureau Federation, but they have always had other sorts of farming and agriculturalist organizations to which they belong.
Someone asked, can you say more about the role of Black women in Farm Bureau and in agriculture in general?
Oh,
Like,
absolutely. Why did you ask that question? I love talking about that. Yes, I think it's incredibly important that we understand that not every Black woman is laboring in the field. And even if they are, their work is not who they are. That's a job, that's a means to an end. In my research, and you'll see a lot of this in my forthcoming book, Black women might be picking the cotton or whatever during the day, but they're the president of the um, home demonstration club in the evening, or they're the vice president, or they're the parliamentarian, or something like that. Um, some of these rural Black women were well educated. They were gene supervising industrial teachers, or they worked with the Arkansas Association of Colored Women's Rural Extension Committee. So, yes, you've got women who are very, very poor, but you've also got women who are well educated, well traveled. They're all working together in the rural community. And I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that we should not equate rurality with ignorance. Now, that's not my original phrasing. I borrowed that from a colleague of mine who wrote a book on white women and the Farm Bureau Federation in Iowa. But when I heard her say that, that just clicked for me. And it made sense because rural people are just rural people, just like urban people are urban people. They're not less intelligent.
when it used to be, power was wrapped up in rural land ownings.
Mhm.
That's the story of the Middle Ages, the feudal holdings, and it carried over, to the United States for the longest time.
Right.
Someone asked, what about African American farm ownership in Arkansas today? What is the level of ownership, and where do you find the location of that ownership?
It's very, very small, but a lot of it is in the Arkansas Delta. As a matter of fact, when I was preparing for this talk today, I saw another article about the Farm Bureau wanting to denounce racism or to address racism or whatever. And the gentleman was doing it in tandem with this guy. I can't remember his name, but he is the executive director of a national Black farmers organization, and he's from Arkansas. So they're there. Are they there in the numbers that they were maybe in the 20s, 30s, and 40s? Certainly not. But again, even in places like Arkansas, I keep going back to that because that's where we are. Black people have always owned land, and some of these people have managed to keep it over the course of several generations. A lot of them were in the Arkansas Delta. The Gammon family still owns their land in Crittenden County, right? Black landowners and farmers exist in places like Phillips County, Arkansas. As a matter of fact, the last chapter of my forthcoming book is about a Black woman named Annie Zachary Pike. Some of you have heard me talk about her before or seen something I published about her, and she still owns her land. And when her husband was alive, she's about 87 years old now. When her husband was alive, they had sharecroppers working for them. So again, that's what I mean when I talk about disrupting narratives. We don't typically hear the story about Black people who own land and hired sharecroppers, but those stories are part of the narrative as well.
Okay. Has there been interest in creating educational tools for sharing these stories in formal and informal school settings? Many of young people don't know this history, and this seems ripe for Arkansas PBS specials.
Not about the Farm Bureau as far as I know, but I expect to be pursuing this research for a very long time to come. And I think there's definitely space for that. There definitely needs to be space for that.
As the Farm Bureau developed into more of a trade association over the years, offering insurance, etc., have you looked at how many Black farmers transitioned into the service side of Farm Bureau as they sold or lost their farms? Did any of them have the opportunity to have one of their insurance franchises? Not sure if they're franchised local representatives of Farm Bureau. So as the way of associating with the Farm Bureau changed.
I'm not sure about that. I just haven't done that research yet. What I can say is once upon a time, Black farmers could not get insurance from the Farm Bureau. And so I have the records to substantiate that as well. So members of the larger Farm Bureau, the mainstream Farm Bureau organization could. So members of the Arkansas Farm Bureau Federation could, but members of the Negro Division at one point could not.
Do you know when that changed?
I think that started, I'm not entirely sure. I'm pretty sure it started to change after the 1960s, but in the period that I'm talking about, it was incredibly difficult for Black farmers to get farm insurance.
Why is it that we do not discuss more of the successes of the Black men and women in the rural South? How can we share more of those empowering stories?
Do the research. See, this is the stuff that's fun for me. And one of the reasons why I got into doing rural history was when somebody told me some time ago that, oh, well, you're talking about rural Black women. There's no political agency. There's no political activism there. I didn't accept that because in my mind, you can define political activism very broadly. So because I didn't accept that, I started looking for it. And what I found was that you may be picking cotton all day, but when you go to your home demonstration club meeting at night and you're talking about things like how to pay poll taxes, that is political activism,
Mm-hmm.
right? When you're singing patriotic songs during World War II because you understand yourself as an American citizen, despite your economic circumstances, that is political activism, right? So if you think broadly about what it means beyond casting a ballot, it's all over the place. So I say that to say if you start looking at the stories where you don't see Black people and rural Black people in particular, all you have to do is dig usually just a very little bit and you'll find it. Case in point, many people don't know that while Black people picked cotton in the rural South, there were also Black owned cotton gins in places like Phillips County and Marvel, Arkansas. These sorts of places existed. Black farmers owned substantial amounts of land. I recently published an article about a guy named Pickens Black Sr. in Jackson County, Arkansas. Had a whole town that was named for him called Blacksville. And at one point, I believe he owned like 6 or 7 or 8,000 acres of land. I mean, we're talking about a man who had enough power that white people were calling him Mr. Black in the 1950s South.
And did you have a chance to listen to that podcast on Isidore Banks?
I have not yet, but I did talk to them. They called me. We chatted quite a bit about that.
But very much the same thing. He was a Black man in Marion, Arkansas, and Crittenden County, and started his own cotton gin, right, so as not to be reliant upon white ginners and
right,
own a significant amount of land. So
right. Well, and actually, right before he was killed, where he had to hide out, he hid out at John Gamma's house. So there are all of these interconnected stories here. But this kind of autonomy among rural Black people was not unusual.
If someone wanted to speak with you after this discussion, are you okay with them contacting you?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Just email me at crjones@astate.edu.
Okay. Where was the Black Farm Bureau when the Black farmers went to Washington, D.C. to get their money back? And where is there any significant Black Farm Bureau presence today, or organized, within the larger bureau?
I know that Black farmers are members, but I can't imagine that the numbers are very large, simply because there just aren't as many Black farmers as there used to be.
What actions would you like to see from Arkansas politicians to further promote equality in our state, and especially the Farm Bureau? What actions might regular people take to also further these goals?
I think the first thing is that we got to start doing the research and learning the history. As I always tell my students, when you look at history, a picture, whatever, you see what's there. Ask questions about that, but also ask questions about what isn't there. If you assume that something couldn't have happened, or if you assume that this is the first Black whatever, I can almost always guarantee you that's not the first Black anything. It's just the first time you've heard of it. So do the digging. I mean, look at these old resources. One of the things that I do to when I take my breaks, I'm dean of the graduate school. When I take a break, you know what I do? I'm looking at old newspapers, many of which have been digitized. I have a subscription to newspapers.com. I can get lost in searching in that for hours. Those stories are there. And usually they're right there in front of you. But because we have not been taught history in a way that centers those kinds of experiences, we often don't even know that they exist.
Well, and you mentioned newspapers.com. People interested in doing more research could also go to Chronicling America.
Right.
Digitized newspapers from the Library of Congress, and they're adding a growing number of Arkansas newspapers.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm on the committee that's working on that, and that's free. You have to pay for newspapers.com. If you're affiliated with a college or a university like Arkansas State University, we have a database called African American Newspapers.com. I get a lot of stuff out of there. We also have African American periodicals. I get things out of there. All of that stuff is digitized. I put this together in a pandemic, okay? And I didn't have to go anywhere to do it because every day they're adding things to these databases. Another one I use is called hoffitrust.org. That's a free digital archives as well. One of the slides on here came from archive.org. That's free as well. So there are lots of things out there in the digital world that allow us to unearth stories that no one has ever heard of.
Hold on. Well, Mark Christ wants you to know that if he ever gets a tattoo, it will say "Do the research." Um,
Art.
has the issue of heirs of inheritance of property adversely affected the economic growth of the Black farmer?
Absolutely, yes.
In what way?
In the sense that they often lose the land because they can't. I mean, they know, right? I mean, oral history is important, but you need legal documentation, which many people don't have. And you also have to take into consideration that people move. People migrated out of state, right? And they've been gone for 30, 40, 50, 60 years, or they die, right? So you say you own this land and that it belongs to the family. How are you going to prove it?
Right.
So that's an issue. Mhm.
Someone asked, she lives in Illinois and recently learned a little information regarding Southern Illinois. Have you done much research pertaining to that part of the country?
I started doing a little bit of it, and actually, in the larger version of this, I talk about that a little bit. But you don't want me talking all night, so I basically
Right.
had to take 21 pages of stuff and distill it down to 8 pages. So yes, that's important because that's another rural story we don't think about. All the rural Black folks are not in the South, right? They're in Illinois. They're in Missouri. They're not all in Kansas City or St. Louis. I mean, they're even out on the prairies, right? In much, much smaller numbers, but they're there.
Well, and even in Arkansas, they were in the Ozarks and the Ouachitas, not just the
Right.
Delta.
Absolutely.
Mm,
Absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of the African American migration experience, we have to diversify that as well, right?
mm. So, is your forthcoming book, the one you're working on the Farm Bureau Federation, is that going to be just Arkansas or cover the larger region?
Oh no, this one is going to cover the larger region. Now that's where I am going to need to travel because I
Mhm.
need to go to these places. The American Farm Bureau Federation records, for example, are at Iowa State University, right? I'm not going to Iowa right now, just because of the weather. But to look at the national records, that's where I need to go. And I want to look at Mississippi. I need to go there. I want to look at Alabama. I'm going to need to go to their state archives and see what they have. So this is what I was able to put together just based on digital sources. But here's the thing about research: you have to travel and look at those other sources because you never know what you're going to find and where. So I always believe in casting a very broad net and just pulling it back in to see what I catch. And over the years, when I've done research, I have been astonished by what I've been able to find just because I said, oh, what the heck, I'll take a look in there and see what it is. It probably won't be anything, but it's exactly what I needed.
I mean, right now, is this sort of the new frontier? I mean, there's just so much here that hasn't been done before.
Um, in terms of rural and agricultural history, absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. I'm a member of the Agricultural Historical Society and the Rural Women's Studies Association. And when I go to those meetings and give presentations, people show up.
Mhm.
People show up because they're like, wow, I didn't know this. I thought Black people were just all these beleaguered and suffering sharecroppers in the South. Some were, but like everybody's story, their story is more complicated and nuanced than that. And here's the evidence.
So, any enterprising student looking for a research project, there's
This
plenty here to dig through.
this field is wide open,
Mhm.
wide open, and it's the sort of research where if you want to give a presentation at the Agricultural History Society, they would welcome it. They
Mhm.
would welcome it. And in fact, the Rural Women's Studies Association is having their meeting at Arkansas State in 2024.
Okay.
So I volunteered for that because I have all the time in the world. But when that happens, I'm going to be pushing hard for people to come and tell these stories because we don't hear them and people don't know they exist. And most people in Arkansas come from a rural background. Most people in the South come from some sort of rural background, but there are all of these stories about um, Black entrepreneurship, Black agency, Black resistance that people don't hear about.
Okay, I think we are going to wrap things up. Um, as noted, if anyone would like to contact Dr. Jones-Branch, they can email her at crjones@astate.edu. The links to your various books are in the chat if people want to check them out. And I will say again right now, if you pre-order Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps from UA Press, that's $16 off the
Which
cover
is
price.
significantly cheaper than my first book.
So you know, the people are saying in the chat they're very grateful to you for sharing your research and putting it out there.
Thank you.
Any closing comments?
Do the research. It's really fun stuff. You would be surprised at what you will uncover about people's lives in rural spaces. The more I do, the more I want to do. And I often ask myself, why wasn't I doing this work before? But I don't want to do it all by myself. So if you have an interest, come join me.
And if you get a tattoo that says "do the research," send us a photograph and we'll put it up on social media. As noted, CALS is also doing Conversations Worth Having every Wednesday this week, and next Monday we will be featuring Dr. Richard Buckaloo of Bethune-Cookman University and his presentation, Loosening the Noose of Judge Lynch, Prevented Lynchings in Arkansas. So if you're interested, register for that. Dr. Jones-Branch, as always, we really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for the
And
invitation.
wish you all the best with your research.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.
Okay, you too.
Bye-bye.